Good evening. This is both a pleasure and honor to lecture here as part of the David Kipper Ancient Israel Lecture Series. I would like to thank Professor Gil Stein and David Sloan, the members of the David Kipper Ancient Israel Lecture Series, for inviting me. It's always great to come here and meet such a concentration of great scholars and colleagues. I would also like to thank the team here in the Oriental Institute that assisted me with all the details around this long trip and very short stay here in Chicago. But you'll see in a minute that this is a really small world. I would especially like to thank Barbara Kipper and the Kipper family, once for supporting the David Kipper Ancient Israel Lecture Series at the Oriental Institute, but once more for another event that they don't know yet about it, and I discovered about it only during my preparation for this lecture. My wife, Yael, is a clinical psychologist specialized in psychoanalysis. And Dr. David Kipper, who served on the faculty of Babylonian University in Israel as an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, is the one who interviewed her in a very long, sensitive, and supportive interview. And Dr. Kipper accepted Yael, my wife, for the MA in clinical psychology and actually opened the most important door for her career. Small world, indeed. The Babylonian attack on the kingdom of Judah at the beginning of the 6th century BCE brought about a desolation and utter destruction of Jerusalem and its immediate environs. The house of David ceased to reign and the temple was left in ruins. Furthermore, the western border of Judah was destroyed as part of the Babylonian military campaign, and the urban and administrative center, the military forts, as well as many of the rural settlements in the region, were crushed and deserted. The peripheral regions of the kingdom in the Negev to the south, as well as in the Judean desert, the Jordan Valley, and the western shore of the Dead Sea, to the east, collapsed probably in a longer, more complex process with ruinous consequences. Many of the Judahites were exiled to Babylon, while many others perished, suffering the harsh penalties of the long war and the presence of the Babylonian forces in Judah, escaped from their homeland and were forced to leave their land and homes. The small kingdom, which had existed for hundreds of years, turned into a province. A new period in the history of Judah had begun. Its borders shrunk, its population depleted sharply, and the social, theological, and historical center of its gravity shifted to the community of deportees in Babylon. This is the picture that for decades scholars have described as the exilic period of Babylonian rule over Judah, the period of the empty land. In recent years, new finds from the 6th century BCE, as well as new studies concerning the archaeology of Judah during this period, have shed new light on our understanding of this gap in the history and archaeology of Judah. This 65 years interval has shown itself to be a period of administrative, economic, and cultural continuity, especially in the close peripheral circle to the north and to the south of Jerusalem. In the first part of this presentation, I will briefly present these new studies and new finds, and will discuss the meaning and implications for our understanding of the Babylonian period of rule over the province of Judah in the 6th century BCE. The continuation of the Judahite administrative center at Ramat Rahel from the late Iron Age to the Persian period is the starting point for the current discussion. The ancient Tel of Ramat Rahel is located on a prominent summit, halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It is one of the highest peaks in the area south of Jerusalem, an ideal location for the fortress and watchtower in direct control on the road which leads to Jerusalem from the south, as well as the road leading to Jerusalem from the west through the Rephaim Valley. The earliest building level at Ramat Rahel was settled in the late 8th or probably in the early 7th century BCE. Few archaeological remains belong to this phase, but large quantity of pottery And about 225 lamelech stamped jar handles are a clear indication that already in the early phase, the site served as the Judahite administrative center. The site was built near Jerusalem at the time when Judah was a vassal kingdom under Assyrian auspices, probably in order to collect goods in kinds, mainly jars of wine and oil. In the second building phase, dated to the last third of the 7th century BCE, the time of King Josiah, an imposing edifice stood atop the mound. This is one of the most impressive structures ever built in biblical Judah. Its walls were built of ashlar blocks unique in Judahite architecture, and it was decorated with volute, the so-called proto-Aeolic capitals, magnificent window balustrades, small limestone-stepped pyramid-shaped stones, and other stone ornaments. And especially famous are the window balustrades that were found in pieces like this, each one composed of 3 different pieces, and when you put them together, you get getting this window balustrade that we know mainly from the many a picture of the woman in the window. And this is the only place that we actually can see the window. The edifice was surrounded on the south, west, and north by a magnificent garden, well built on artificially flattened bedrock. So you can see that all over the site we found that they removed the hard Nari rock, made a flat, like a tennis court, and above it there was 40 to 50 centimeters of garden soil. In and around the area, large pools with high-quality ashlars were built, surrounded by tunnels, channels, and other water installations covered with thick layer of plasters. And you can see here some of the items that we just uncovered in the last years. There is no evidence for the destruction of Ramat Rahel at the beginning of the 6th century BCE when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. The renewed excavations clearly demonstrated that the site continued to exist during the 6th century BCE when Jerusalem was in ruins and Mitzpah, Tel Enatzbe, was the capital of Judah. Throughout this period, the second building phase of the edifice and the garden persisted without marked change. And only at the Persian period, the edifice was expanded on its northwestern corner. The remains of a new building, both strong and large, were exposed. Rectangular in shape, it was built on the northwestern side of the edifice complex and comprises a new wing added to the existing complex surrounding the largest pool of the second building phase. And this is the way we found it, this is the plan, and this is how we reconstruct this section, the new section of the building. In the southeastern corner of the site, a huge pit was excavated that contained hundreds of pottery vessels, among them more than 10 restorable jars, some of them bearing stamp impressions. This pit contained the first 6th century pottery assemblage, as will be discussed later. And you can see that we excavate this pit very carefully. This is the cut of the pit and how we draw it. And all the time we found hundreds and thousands of pieces of pottery. And when we brought them to the restoration lab, the very talented staff over there started to build all the corpus of pottery that I will talk about later. The many new finds from the Persian period, together with hundreds of stamp impressions on jar handles dated to the Persian and early Hellenistic occupation periods at the site, are the best indication that Ramat Rahel was the main center of the Yehud system in which the jars circulated. The possible involvement of the central Achaemenid government may be indicated by the intensive construction at the site and in the unusual creation of the additional wing of the northwestern side of the existing edifice. And I will talk much more about Ramat Rahel in the lecture that I will give here tomorrow. As for the history of the site during the 6th century BCE, it seems that the continuous function of Ramat Rahel as an administrative site is best attested by the continuity of use of the system of stamped jar handles. The unique administrative nature of Ramat Rahel is best reflected in its profusion of stamped jar handles. Over 300 stamp handles from the late Iron Age have been found at the site, including Lamelech and private stamp impression from the late 8th and 7th century BCE, and rosette stamp impressions from the late 7th and early 6th century BCE. In the Persian and Hellenistic period, too, Ramat Rahel was the main center of stamp jar handles with more than 300 Yehud stamp impressions dated to the late 6th to the mid-2nd century BCE, and Yerushalayim stamp impressions from the Hasmonean period in the middle of the 2nd century. All in all, this phenomenon takes in more than half millennium of continuous, systemized administration of the collecting of jars of wine and oil. During long periods of this half millennium, Ramat Rahel functioned as the main Judahite administration and collection center, as is evidenced by the presence at this small site of the largest number of most of the different types of stamp handles excavated in Judah. The lion stamp jar handles are the main part of the 6th century BCE administration in Judah. Wedged between the two systems of stamp jar handles, that from the Iron Age and that from the Persian and Hellenistic periods, another system existed in Judah and mainly in Ramat Rahel. The lion stamp impression on the body or the handles of jars. 77 lion stamp jar handles were excavated at Ramat Rahel out of a total of about 110 stamped handles known to us to date. Until recently, scholars dated the lion stamp impression to the very beginning of the Persian period. The reason is the absence of these stamped handles from the classic Persian period strata on the one hand, and the historical assumption that they cannot be dated to the pre-Persian period because it's the exilic period, the time of the empty land. Besides, Ephraim Stern, an Israeli archaeologist, interpreted the object or indistinct sign, which is part of the scene depicting a lion standing on his legs with the two front legs stretched out wide, as an Achaemenid fire altar. And you can see the fire altar, the Achaemenid fire altar to the bottom right, and the same picture you have in the museum, as you can go and see here, just beside us. However, a new study of the iconography of this type hints toward the connection of these objects with the Assyrian Babylonian world and interpret these objects as a human head in profile, just as it is well known from the Babylonian world, and you can see this head, this profile, like the leftovers of what the lion had ate. No? And you can see very clearly how this head is also from this stamp impression from Tel Dan. And you can see that even if the Judahites were not such a skilled artisans, they actually tried to make the same head in profile as we know from the Babylonian world. Furthermore, petrographic analysis of the lion stamped handles show as a resemblance to Iron Age, late 7th, early 6th century patterns of the rosette jar handles, rather than to the Persian period pattern of the Yehud jars. And this is strengthening the date of the lion stamp impression to the 6th century BCE. The conclusion is that the lion stamped impression system belongs to an earlier and wider 6th century BCE administrative system, and that it should be placed in the Babylonian period. This is the missing link in the administrative continuity in Judah. It was part of the Babylonian administration that lasted until the beginning of the Persian period, at which point it was replaced by the Yehud stamp impression system. The prominence of the lion stamp impression is another indication that Ramat Rahel continued to have a prominent administrative role during the 6th century BCE under the Babylonian rule. So, beside the new understanding that the land was not empty during the exilic period, that administration continued mainly at Ramat Rahel, we also have now well-based archaeological indications for the continuation in pottery production in Judah between the end of the Iron Age and the Persian period. The new pottery assemblage from Ramat Rahel is one of the few known thus far that clearly fills the gap and thus supports the assumption that the local traditions of pottery production continued throughout the 6th century BCE. The newly discovered pottery assemblage from Ramat Rahel, from all different types, stand as a clear marker for this group of 6th century BCE pottery assemblage. Similar pottery assemblages can be found at a number of central sites, primarily in the Benjamin region, like Tel Aviv, several defined loci in Stratum 1 in Tel Natzbe, which is biblical Mitzpah, as well as the well-defined pottery assemblage at Beitin, Bet-El, and El Jib, which is biblical Gibeon. All the above data, and you can see that we have pottery from all the different kinds, from cooking pots to small juglets, to oil lamps, and of course, to jars. All the above data supports a continuation in the rural settlements to the north and to the south of Jerusalem. During the Babylonian period, a marked change took place in the characteristics of the settled areas. The settlement center of gravity moved from Jerusalem to the close periphery, and a new pattern of settlement was created in which the core was depleted and the nearby periphery continued to exist almost unchanged. The Judahite population that continued to subsist in the northern Judean highlands, as well as in Benjamin region, continued to preserve its material culture without any sign for destruction or crisis. And there lies the great difficulty posed to archaeological research in discerning this culture and defining it. Many scholars have discerned the different fate of the Benjamin region and the archaeological reality in it after the destruction of Jerusalem. The biblical description regarding the fate of this region during the Babylonian campaign to Jerusalem and after the destruction of the city, together with excavation data of the main sites explored in the Benjamin region and the data of surveys conducted there, attest that the region was not destroyed together with Jerusalem, and as a historical interpretation of this data, one may assume that already before the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonians had chosen Mitzpah, Tel Natzbe, as the alternative capital of the Babylonian province, and appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, as the first governor. And you can see that in Mitzpah we have a lot of administrative material together with a lot of Babylonian material. The area to the south of Jerusalem and the Rephaim Valley in its center probably had the same fate as the Benjamin region. The Rephaim Valley, probably known in the biblical period as the Valley of the King, has historically been one of the prosperous agricultural districts in the environment of Jerusalem, vital to the economy of the city. The mounting archaeological data from this area, underscored by the many agricultural installations and small farmsteads found in and around the valley, confirms that those periods during which the Valley of the King flourished agriculturally are the same periods during which there was construction at Ramat Rahel. I mean, from the late Iron Age to the Persian period, with no sign of hiatus. The pottery discovered in these sites in the Rephaim Valley is the same as we have in Ramat Rahel. So we have a lot of pottery from the end of the Iron Age to the Persian period, and we have a lot of stamp impression, again, Yehud, Lamelech, Rosette, Lions, and Yehud stamp impression, and again, demonstrating that these sites continue to exist all along these periods. I will not discuss here with a very unique phenomenon of these tumuli around the Rephaim Valley. Maybe I will talk about it a little bit tomorrow, which are an artificial mounds built all around the Rephaim Valley, and the main thing in all of them is not only the same periods that we just discussed with the same fine stamp impression, but also that from all these tumuli we have a direct eye contact to one site, and you can guess Ramat Rahel. So from all of them one can see the site of Ramat Rahel. What is the significance of these new finds and new studies for understanding the historical reality of the 6th century BCE and the Babylonians' rule in Judah during the exilic period? The significance is that after the destruction of Jerusalem and the other main urban and military Judahite centers by the Babylonians at the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the people who were left in the land of Judah continued to live in close proximity to the north and to the south of Jerusalem, continued to maintain a rural economy, continued to gather wine and oil and other agricultural products in the same way and in similar stamped jars as they had previously in order to pay the annual tribute to the empire, continued to produce pottery nearly in the same Iron Age tradition, and continued to serve under the same administration. The administrative center at Ramat Rahel continued to function as the collection center of the agricultural production, mainly in the form of jars filled with wine and oil, with no marked change, except for the new lion stem impression on the handles of the jars, which replaced the rosette stem impressions on the same types of jars until the destruction of Jerusalem. In many aspects, these observations confirm the conclusion that the Babylonian Empire continued the Assyrian ideology and administration, took over the Assyrian provincial system, and made only the minimal and needed adjustments. The major and most conspicuous archaeological phenomenon in the 6th century BCE Judah, after the destruction of Jerusalem, was the sharp decline in urban life, which is in contrast to the continuity of the rural settlements in the region of Benjamin and in the northern Judean hills. This settlement pattern also continued throughout the Persian period when, despite the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the restoration of its status as the capital of the province, there was no strengthening of urban life in this area, and the settlement in Judah remained largely based on the rural population. These new observations concerning the 6th century BCE Judah fit well with the biblical account of this period, both with the description of the destruction of Jerusalem and with the description of the days of Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, in the short period afterwards. There are some clear clues in the biblical description about the destruction of the border fortresses and cities in the Shephelah, in the lowland, to the west of Jerusalem, and this information fits well with archaeological data concerning the destruction of these sites, as well as many small towns, villages, and hamlets in the region, and the mention of Azekah, the place that we are excavating now, in Ostracon number 4 in Lachish. The biblical description of the period of the Babylonian destruction focuses, however, on the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of the centers of government and religious ritual in the city, as well as the burning of all the houses and the total destruction of the city walls. This description accords with the archaeological finds that were revealed in excavations all over the city of Jerusalem. It seemed that the beginning of the systematic destruction of Jerusalem, about a month after the king's flight and the surrender of the city, is evidence that this was not a spontaneous deed. It was a considered and conscious political decision attesting to a strategic decision of the Babylonians to obliterate the center of rebellion and to prevent its future rebuilding. In the same time, in the same line, the biblical description mentions only the deportation of the population of Jerusalem and doesn't mention deportations from other areas in Judah. This description accords with the accounts mentioning the poorest people of the land who were left by Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard. This is a description deriving from the qualitative, economic, and class-oriented judgment of the elite deported to Babylon towards those who remained in the land, pronounced also in the tendentious summary generalization. So Judah was carried away captive out of his land. There is only a semantic gap between this attitude towards the question of how many were deported and from where, and how many remained and where, and the attitude toward the same questions in the two versions describing the days of Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, who ruled in Judah after the destruction of Jerusalem. According to these verses, those who remained in the land, in Judah, were not the poorest people of the land, but rather the people who remained in the land of Judah. Men, women from those who were not deported to Babylon, or even a remnant for Judah. They were left under the leadership of Gedaliah to continue the national life of the people in its land, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is the one who left them in the land. There is no details in the biblical description regarding how many people remained in Judah after the destruction of Jerusalem, since the focus of the description is the deportation of the people from Jerusalem. It is reasonable to assume that the remnant was part of the rural population, especially in the regions around the city. Gedaliah was officially appointed over those who remained in Judah, and this population had a well-defined status and place probably in the region of Benjamin and in the environs of Jerusalem. This is the reason and the background to the description of the days of Gedaliah's rule in Mitzpah. Gedaliah demanded the people left in the land and refugees that were in Moab, in Ammon, in Edom, and in all the countries, and returned out of all the places where they were scattered in order to join the people who were left in Judah. And he told them, dwell in the land, serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you. The conclusion from all the above is that there is an agreement between the biblical description of the days of the destruction and the archaeological finds. The Babylonians dealt a harsh blow to the kingdom of Judah, the harshest blow in the history of the kingdom. They destroyed Jerusalem as well as many of the urban, military, economic, and administrative centers. They deported the king and all the religious, economic, social, and political elite, and Judah lost its independence. From the demographic point of view, based on all the available archaeological data, one can estimate that as a result of the long war and as part of the effect and outcome, there was an approximately 60% decline in population in Judah from about 110 Judahites living in Judah before the destruction to about 40,000 Judahites living in Judah afterwards. With this reconstruction in mind, understanding what between the exilic period and the myth of the empty land, we can move from the Babylonian to the Persian period and check what behind the theories on the mass return and the new era in the history of Judah and the Judeans. Because if there was not empty land, so how can it be that there is mass return? From the historical point of view, the 205 years of the so-called Persian period constitute a well-defined phase. There is a clear starting point when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, and there is a defined end when the Persian Empire fell into the hands of Alexander the Great's army. The dates were also meaningful in the history of the western provinces of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires along the Mediterranean coast and in the inland areas, and mark the chronological borders of the period of Achaemenid rule of the region. For Judah, the dates mark the Persian Achaemenid period of the return to Zion and the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem after 50 years of exile in Babylon. The history of Judah in this period is marked by three major events: the return from Babylon, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall in the time of Nehemiah. These events are rooted in biblical description as well as in many historical reconstructions of the history of Judah and the Judeans. Bearing in mind the importance, uniqueness, and many different processes that took place during this period, and taking into account the many biblical texts that were written and edited in Judah, probably as part of the spiritual, religious, cultic, social, and national developments and evolutions that transpired during this 200 years interval, I would like to raise three basic questions regarding the understanding of the history of and the material culture of this period. One, are there indications in the material culture for changes that took place in the transition from the Babylonian to the Persian Achaemenid rule, from the exilic to the post-exilic period? Are there any reasons from the archaeological perspective to define the 200 years of the Persian rule over Judah as a separate period? And can archaeological research identify such sub-periods within the Persian period? Most of these questions have never been raised in studies of the Persian period, history and archaeology. The reason for this is that scholars who dealt with this period, particularly in Judah, had clear views of the historical process that the region experienced between the 6th and the 3rd centuries BCE regarding the nature of the exilic and post-exilic period, the empty land before the Persian period and the mass return at the beginning of this period, the history of the land with its peak in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, even if it was reconstructed by some scholars as the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, or only as the time of Nehemiah. It seems that the reflection of this period in the different biblical description, as much as this reflection was understood as segmented, caused scholars to base their reconstructions on the biblical text and to study the Persian period in Judah with different methods and standards from those accepted for other periods in the history of the land. In the coming few minutes, I will try to present some answers to these questions as part of the general new perspective on the history and archaeology of the Persian period in Judah, and to raise few new thoughts regarding the history of this period. So, what do we know about and what kind of archaeological material do we have from the Persian period in Judah? Besides the new finds from Ramat Rahel that were already described and will be served as the main starting point for tomorrow's lecture, in most of the sites in Judah, there is no distinct stratum with a well-defined pottery assemblage from the Persian period. Even in Jerusalem, the main finds from the Persian period are scattered pottery, sherds, and other small finds, especially stamp impressions, typical to this period. In the western hill of Jerusalem, only few pottery sherds and other small finds from the Persian period have been found, in most cases in unclear stratigraphic landfills from the Hellenistic and especially from the Roman periods. In the city of David, it seems that the presumed narrow inhabited area of the Persian and early Hellenistic period was limited to the upper part of the hill, and even in these areas, pottery sherds from the Persian period as well as stamp impressions were discovered in most cases as part of a fill and with no clear stratigraphic or architecture. Stratum 9, dated to the Persian period, was mainly discovered in area E. This is in the lower part of the site, an area that we are excavating now again, part of it because of the Persian period, of course. And this is the only area in Jerusalem that actual architecture can be found, but very poor, very miserable architecture. If I'm trying to collect very quickly all the data that we have on the Persian period in the city of David and trying to define the areas with no Persian period find with the area that we have Persian period finds, so I can see that only in these small areas we actually have any remains from the Persian period. And I mean from the time that Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 to the time of the Hasmonean rule in the 2nd century. So it's something like 300 years of rule with nearly nothing in Jerusalem. Even if we collect all this area and we reconstruct the settlement in the Persian period, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, to this area, so this is the proportions between the end of the 1st temple period and between the most of the time of the 2nd temple period until this time of the Hasmoneans. In this area, no more that 200 or 300 families can live. Something like 1,000, maybe 1,200 people could live in Jerusalem all over the Persian period and until the time of the Hasmonean revolt. In all the other sites in Judah, Persian period finds are meager and most are out of any archaeological context. This conclusion is not new. Both Olbert and Kenyon already wrote in the 50s, in the last century, claimed that the archaeological data reflects the cessation of town life in Persian period and the concentration of the population in villages. In any case, from the archaeological material dated to the Persian period in Judah, one clear conclusion should be stated. During the Persian period, as a continuation of the Assyrian and Babylonian periods that preceded it, there is a marked process of attenuation in urban life. This phenomenon stands in contrast to the continuation of the rural settlement in the northern part of the Judean hills and in the region of Benjamin. Let me try to clarify the problem of the chronological borders around and within the archaeology of the post-exilic period, the Persian period. Leaving biblical material aside, are there clear lines separating the material culture of the 6th century BCE from that of the 5th and 4th centuries, lines that differentiate between the exilic and post-exilic periods, and that distinguish between the pre-Ezra and Nehemiah and the post-Ezra and Nehemiah periods? It seems to me that many of the archaeological studies of this period have been consciously or unconsciously affected by the biblical description. They have dealt with this period as a distinctive period because this is how it described in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Based on this description, scholars describe 3 different phases within the Persian period. The first generation of returnees who came in order to build the temple, the generation of Ezra and Nehemiah who built the walls of Jerusalem and repopulated the city, and later part of the Persian period, what we call the post-Ezra and Nehemiah time. However, no clear chronological foothold for any historical or archaeological aspect of the study of Judah in the Persian period has been found in or around the 200-year slot of the Persian period. There is also no apparent indication for any variation between this period and the preceding one, the so-called Babylonian or exilic period of the 6th century, nor with the subsequent period, the early Hellenistic period in the late 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. It is a long period with only minor and gradual changes in the material culture, with not even one clear destruction level after 586 BCE that can be used as an archaeological and chronological anchor and as a historical tool for reconstructing actual events described in biblical and extra-biblical text. No demographic change can be detected, no any mass return can be found, no change in settlement pattern, no change in administration or economy, no change in pottery production or any other aspect of the material culture, probably aside from a sharp change in glyptic traditions and the disappearance of the icon in stamps used for stamping jar handles that may be the outcome of the new Judaism of the few returnees that came to Judah. There are only small and gradual changes in all aspects of the material culture from script to pottery that slowly brought new shapes and characteristics and created the classic Persian period shapes and features from that crystallized and characterized the second half of the 5th and early 4th century BCE. Later, there are further slow and gradual changes that created the so-called late Persian, early Hellenistic material culture of the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, again, with no one clear chronological and historical foothold for the date of the change. The new find that recently, and some recent studies in the last few years have shed new light on this period. I will not mention again the new understanding of the pottery assemblages from the Persian period as discovered at Ramat Rahel, but one clear from the 6th and the 5th and the other from the late 4th century BCE, which complete our knowledge of Persian period pottery from the chronological as well as from the typological perspective. And again, we were lucky to find the pottery clear assemblage from the early Persian period, and this is something that I showed you before. And at Ramat Rahel, we also have, again, good luck, and we found a local destruction well dated to the late 4th century BC. And again, you can see the destruction here, and you can see the many pottery sherds that we found in the destruction, and you can see the many different pottery that we combine in our restoration lab. And again, we have a clear understanding of what is the different pottery shapes that we have in the early Persian and in the late Persian period. The fact that these pottery assemblages come hand in hand with well-dated and sorted stamp jar handles can base the dates of these pottery groups and make it easier to identify it in other sites, even small and rural sites that contain only small amounts of pottery from the Persian period. The stamped jar handles are the new and real chronological tool for studying the Persian period. The many different types of Yehud stamp impressions were well grouped and sorted in a very long work that I conducted together with my colleague David Van Hooft from Boston College. And we have a clear 17 different types of stamp impressions according to 3 main chronological periods. The early types from the late 6th and the 5th century, the middle types from the 4th century and 3rd century, and the late types from the Hasmonean period from the 2nd century BCE. When a specific type of stamp impression was discovered or was absent from a specific site, from a specific stratum, or, for example, was discovered only in the city of David and not in the southwestern hill of Jerusalem or vice versa, it means a great deal for the archaeological, chronological, and administrative points of view, taking into account the large number of stamped handles discovered at the main site in Judah. And this tablet that reconstructs, all the types of Yehud stamp impression is now the main chronological tool, the main archaeological tool to discern on the different sub-periods within the Persian period. Ramat Rahel produced the largest number of stamp impressions with about more than 50% of all the stamp impressions, and 2/3 of the early types, again from the late 6th and early in 5th century, and there is 60% of the total number of the middle types, and again in the late types you can see that Ramat Rahel is going down and Jerusalem is going up. Jerusalem was not the main administrative center represented in the corpus of the Yehud stamp impression, especially among the early and the middle types. It means from all the Persian period. The various excavated areas throughout the city produced mainly stamp impression from the late type, again from the 2nd century. This is the period that Jerusalem became again an important city, not before. No early or middle types were excavated in the western hill of Jerusalem, and it's really the clearest indication to the history of the site. Of all the different sites, we have clear indication of what's going on in all the different periods of the Persian period. It is significant that all the major sites of Yehud stamp impression in Judah, only few belong to the early types, and the vast majority belong to the middle types. At all these sites, without exception, no stamped handles from the late types, from the Hellenistic period, have been discovered. This fact can be combined with the changes that occurred in Judah in the early Hellenistic period, and especially in the 2nd century BCE under Hasmonean control. The historical and administrative meaning of the data presented above is that the main change in material culture occurred later in the Persian period, probably during the late 5th or even the early 4th century BCE, when a fundamental modification in the form, style, paleography, and orthography occurred, probably as a result of the growing importance of the southern Levant for the Persian Empire when it lost its hegemony over Egypt. The consolidation in stamping practices in Yehud is apparently one of the numerous other changes that occurred in the southern Levant after the Achaemenid lost its control over Egypt. Achaemenid authority over populations in the border region was probably tightened, as highlighted by the Aramaic ostraka from the southern Shephelah, as well as the date of the establishment of the edifice, the Persian edifice in Lachish, and probably some other forts in the Judean hills, the Shephelah and the Negev area. The changes that occurred in the system of the Yehud stamp impression of the mill types were probably a result of a tighter Persian control in the administration of the distribution system, which the stamps reflect when the name of the province or its abbreviated form became the only necessary piece of information on the stamps. The names of local administrators were no longer relevant for the system, and only the source of the product, the name of the province, was significant. As part of this change, some other secondary administrative center assumed a much more important role in the system of the stamp impression. And many stamp impressions were discovered at different other sites like Jericho, Nebi Samuel, and even in En-Gedi. Again, this picture was changed in the 2nd century with the Hasmonean revolt and the gain of the independence in Judah. Let's summarize the new perspective on the archaeology of the Persian period in Judah. The new finds from the Persian period Judah brought to light new directions and new options to the understanding of this period. Unlike most of the studies on the archaeological material in Second Temple Judah, which start the description as it is obvious fact, at the beginning of the Persian period, it becomes clear that all the different aspects of the material culture of the period continued from the late Iron Age through the 6th century BCE without any break and with only marginal changes in the material culture in the transition from the Babylonian to the Persian Achaemenid rule. Most of the characteristics of the early Persian period, like script, stamp impressions, and pottery, can be defined as intermediate Iron Age Persian period material. Furthermore, unlike most studies on the material culture in the early Second Temple period, which describe the Persian period as a marked and defined period from the archaeological point of view, there are 3 distinctive periods within the 200 years of Persian rule in Judah, with a marked continuity and development between them. The early Persian period in the late 6th and early 5th century BCE is a transitional period from Iron Age and Babylonian period with no marked change in the material culture, when most of the aspect of material culture, including pottery and script, looks like a clear continuation. The typical classic and well-known material culture of the Persian period can be dated to the second half of the 5th century and to the first half of the 4th century BCE. The main change in the form, style, paleography, and orthography of the Yehud stamp system occurred during the late 5th or even the early 4th century BCE, probably as a result of a tighter Persian control in the administration. As part of this change, some secondary administrative centers took a much more important role in the system, and at these sites, the most important Persian period pottery and other finds were discovered. The late Persian, early Hellenistic material culture is well dated to the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE. The change in the material culture, especially the script and pottery, was probably slow and gradual, and as can be seen from the Yehud stamp impressions, there is a clear continuity in administration and economy from the late Persian to the early Hellenistic period, from the Persian to the Ptolemaic periods, from nearly every aspect. The marked changes in nearly every facet of the material culture occurred in the middle of the 2nd century BCE under the Hasmonean rule. We can speak much more about this effect tomorrow when we'll be more deep in the Persian period, and I will demonstrate that when we are going to the history with this understanding of the Persian period, we have many more historical questions that we can ask and many more answers that we can get, but this is for another lecture. Thank you very much.